Once again, I am happy to say that this video is sponsored by Dutch TMC, the first aid equipment company that brings you some of the highest quality products available on the private market. Now, last time I told you about their newly released Warrior Box, a sort of military-grade first aid kit, and now, just in time for the upcoming season, Mission 2 comes in as the new and improved Warrior Box Holiday Special. It has even more items than the first one did, and is all better suited to help make you prepared for potential emergency situations. Now, I'm not saying that if you happen to be on the receiving end of a firing squad, as is the subject of this video, that the Warrior Box will be sufficient to save your life. You may want to have a medical professional and whatnot, but it'll definitely do a lot better for you than, a Band-Aid and some ointments. Just throwing the idea out there. The owner of Dutch TMC is an actual veteran of 10 years service as a combat nurse, and he's used that experience in designing the Warrior Box to actually be a proper survivalist kit. Every item in the box has been carefully selected among the best products available on the market today, with the intention that if, heaven forbid, you ever actually need to use those products, you won't be let down by them. Dutch TMC is accepting pre-orders now for their Mission 2 of the Warrior Box. All you need to do to learn more about that is visit the link in the description down below. Thank you again to Dutch TMC for sponsoring this video, and now on to the program. Firing squads. Everyone's favorite method of execution, isn't it? That's a normal thing to say, right? It doesn't make me a, Anyways, any student of military or criminal justice history will be well familiar with the principle and function of a firing squad. I mean, they are pretty straightforward, but all the same, in my experience, there are still a few funny ideas that tend to float around about them. Most particularly, I remember having this idea as a child. Don't worry, I'm sure a lot of kids dwell on the mechanics of a firing squad when they're younger. It's just purely childish fantasy. I only ever put it into practice, once or twice in my life. In any case, I had this funny idea that within a firing squad, as a policy, only one of the soldiers would actually be loaded with a live round, while all of the others would fire blanks. Now, I don't know entirely where this idea came from. I imagine it was sort of a combination of, on the one hand, just blindly accepting information as it was presented to me by, supposed authority figures on the History Channel. I mean, it's the History Channel. Surely they know what they're talking about. Things like that. And on the other hand, a sort of a corruption in my own mind, my own childish mind, of genuine facts, misremembering it, mixing it with maybe like some other slightly, scurious information that I heard elsewhere, and then, we have this idea coming about. I can't imagine that I'm the only person to have ever actually thought this, because the thing is that there is some truth to the statement, just in a roundabout kind of way, which I'll discuss by the end of this video. There's kind of a few subjects wrapped into one here. But for now, the idea. One live round out of however many blanks. Now, purportedly, this was done to add a sense of reasonable doubt into the mix, to make it so that any individual soldier wouldn't necessarily know if they were the one to have, done the killing, and as such, it was there to ease their guilty conscience. Again, at least that's how I understood the idea before I realized better, and I do see, in a couple of different sources here and there, this idea is repeated, the idea that a blank round is left in the mix to make it to where the soldier doesn't really know if they're the one who did the killing or not. Now, if you've ever shot a live firearm before, you already know why this is kind of silly, because firing a live round actually feels very different from firing a blank round. It's very simple physics, which, now granted, I hardly understand it, but it's equal and opposite reactions and all that. When you're firing a blank round, I believe I'm supposed to do this when I hold an object up to the camera so that it actually, tracks it. When you fire a blank round, you get an explosion in the barrel from, the gunpowder inside of it going off, but beyond the blast itself and potentially some little, fragments of metal, if it happens to break off from the cartridge, nothing is actually leaving the barrel. It just goes poof, and then the empty cartridge is, sent out of the gun. There's very little in the way of recoil because there's very little in the way of equal and opposite, force being applied back into the gun and into your shoulder. Now, whereas if you fire a live round, in front of that explosive force is an actual object. The energy isn't able to escape into the open air as quickly because there's a bullet in front of it, in the way, in the gun barrel, that needs to be pushed out of the way, for that for that explosive force to escape and whatnot. It uses up a lot more energy to push that bullet out of the way, and you feel all of that energy in your arm in the form of recoil. Live rounds can also be a lot louder than blanks, although, to be fair, in a firing squad, that wouldn't necessarily matter as much because, well, you're surrounded by other rifles that are all going off at once. The point is, though, that any soldier who is in a firing squad, any individual, would easily be able to tell whether they actually shot the prisoner or not, whether they fired a live round or a blank round. It becomes apparent in their mind. But of course, don't just take my word for that. I actually went to a firing range a few weeks back with some of my reenactor friends where I thought it would be fun to demonstrate exactly what I mean by all of this. Here you can see me firing a blank round out of my British short magazine Lee Enfield rifle from the First World War. And then here you can see me firing a live round. The difference there is obvious. The live round jumps back on you a whole lot more. Now, to be fair though, that is not a wholly scientific test. I knew which round was which, and as such, I may have positioned myself differently each time so that I could better demonstrate my point. Not to say that I would lie to you like that, but, subconsciously may have played a role. So, to further prove how easy it is to tell whether you fired a live round or a blank round, if you have any experience with the firearm at hand, or really any firearm for the most part, I asked my friends to help me perform a blind test. I went just around a corner and I asked them to load 3 SMLEs. We had 3 of them available, which is really cool. 2 of them with blank rounds and 1 of them with a live round to see if I could, shoot them all and tell the difference, see which one was which. One of these 3 rifles has a live round inside. The other 2 have blank rounds. Let's see if I can actually tell the difference between them all. So, rifle number 1, safety off. Something tells me that was a blank round. Rifle number 2, safety off. Something tells me that as well was a blank round. And rifle number 3. There's also a blank round.
Oi, I've here a real live round. Here you go.
The point of my test has been disturbed slightly, but that's all right. A live round. You can tell the difference there a little bit, I think. So it turns out that the test was actually even more blind than I first thought it was, but I think it's actually better off that way. It proves that I wasn't adding any fake recoil into the mix. I wasn't, making it look all the stronger, adding anything to try and prove my point anymore. And it proves, that anyone who's taking part in a firing squad would immediately know if they'd fired a live round or not. It wouldn't help with their conscience at all unless they were the ones fortunate enough to have received a blank round, in which case they would know for certain that they didn't shoot the prisoner. Or, of course, I suppose, unless the soldier was so just incredibly distraught by their duty that some psychological issue took over of some kind, and they just outright went into denial that they'd fired a live round. But that, I think, is kind of besides the point and goes far deeper into other subjects, so it's far deeper than I'd like to go to today. Now, it might also be said, to be fair, that the purported anonymity of the so-called conscience round is actually intended not for the shooter, but any potential onlookers who may judge the executioners as a result. Now, a public firing squad may not be so common as a public hanging, but to be sure, there have been plenty of instances historically, where you have people watching a firing squad take place. And yes, it's possible that when an audience is looking at a full squad of men, they're less likely to catch the individual with the live rounds as opposed to any blank rounds. However, that is just a matter of the numbers involved. And it's almost certain that if you have an audience of really any significant scale, that at least one of them is going to catch which guns were live and which guns weren't. We did a little test at the range for that too, and here you can see 3 of us are lined up, ready to fire at a mark. Now see, watching this footage, if you can tell which ones of us are firing blank rounds and which of us are firing live rounds. 1, fire. 1, fire. 1, fire. 1, fire. So again, there may be a bit more confusion in the mix, but it's usually still pretty easy to tell. You just have to know what to look for. Once that round is fired, it's very difficult to maintain any level of actual anonymity. But then, where does that leave our conscience round? It can't be for the soldiers themselves who's actually shooting, and if it can't be for any onlookers, I certainly can't imagine it would be any consolation to the man actually getting shot that only some of the bullets are entering him and the other ones are fake. So is this idea just a myth? Well, not quite. I initially assumed that they must be, but as it turns out, no, indeed, there are instances of blank rounds being used in firing squads. So were the men using those blank rounds just inept? Had they never fired a gun before? Or was this just some, administrator thinking, oh, we'll include a blank round so no one will know, and then it never actually works? Well, again, not quite. The thing about the conscience round, I think, is that it isn't very well named, in my opinion. I don't think it's very well named. It'll do very little, is the thing, to actually alleviate the conscience of most of the men taking part in a firing squad after the fact. What it does do, however, is provide a doubt beforehand. Look back to my blind test. I was easily able to tell which round was which after the fact. But I had no way of knowing which was which beforehand, because of which I made sure to act as if all of the rounds could be blank or live. I was keeping my finger off the trigger, muzzle down range, all that kind of thing. So when the members of a firing squad are handed their preloaded rifles, if you have a conscience round, you don't have the men load them on the site, you give them to the men after, the squad's been formed up, so to say, they won't know which one they've got. They will know once they pull the trigger, but until they do, that is when they have their reasonable doubt. And because of that doubt, every individual member is able to tell themselves that maybe theirs isn't the real round. The idea behind it, at least, is that every individual would be more psychologically capable of actually aiming true to their mark. They won't shoot to wound, they won't purposely miss the target, they will aim directly at the heart. Or at the very least, they are more inclined to be able to do so. I won't speak to the psychology behind it all, but that is at least the idea, is that if a man knows he's about to shoot someone who's standing mercilessly or who's standing helplessly right in front of him, he is less inclined to do so, to kill someone that way. Whereas if there's that doubt that, well, maybe when I pull the trigger, nothing will happen, they're more inclined to do so. That's the logic. That's the thought behind it. I won't go into whether that's correct or not, or good or bad, or if it worked or if it didn't work, whatever. That's the idea, though. So in a way, while yes, I suppose it could help with the nerves of the shooter, before the fact, it can help them console themselves, well, maybe I won't shoot the guy. I think that the true benefit of the conscience round is actually more for the condemned than it is for the executioner. Because again, the executioner, as soon as he pulls that trigger, he's going to know that he did the deed. Let's circle back really quickly to the numbers of all of this. Now, I was told so long ago that only one round in a firing squad would be live and all of the rest of them would be blanks. Now, I'm not saying that this never happened. In the totality of human history, there is always an exception to the rule. However, I will say that this goes against the basic principle of the conscience round, and as such is not how it would generally be done unless the individuals putting on that firing squad, yes, happened to be cruel or incapable or just exceedingly silly. The purpose of a firing squad is very straightforward. It is not to wound, it is not to inflict pain or torture, it is to kill the condemned quickly, efficiently, and indeed as humanely as possible. Now, unlike what video games and sometimes movies will tell us, a bullet is not an instant kill machine, and human life is a very stubborn thing. If you only have one live round in an entire firing squad, even if that shooter is aiming true to the target with the knowledge that they might not be the one to actually do the deed, they can still miss the target. They can hit not the heart, but a lung, or the neck, or any other place. And if the live round misses the mark, well, then there's a very good chance that you're not left with a clean and easy kill, a body to be buried, and everyone can move on with their day. No, you're left with a fatally wounded man who now needs to be put out of his misery. And then it's the sergeant's duty to walk up and finish the job. It's uncomfortable for everyone. This is why it's a firing squad and not just an executioner, a firing squadee. You want multiple rounds going into that little slip of paper marking out the condemned person's heart to make sure that at least a few of them are likely to hit true, killing the person more instantly, efficiently, and with less pain. So if you're going to include conscience round, which are designed to make sure that every man is aiming true, you don't want to undercut that same purpose by having too many conscience rounds. You generally want to ensure that they are at least the smaller portion of the rounds, or that you have a lot of participants in that firing squad, so that way, again, it's more efficient. And even then, when you have a lot of people, of course, there's hardly any guarantee that the person being shot actually dies outright. And actually, as a brief aside, I think this really also goes to show just how immensely cruel something like a mass execution is. It's already difficult enough to ensure a quick death where there is one prisoner and 5 or 10 or whatever have you rifles, so much so that things like indeed the conscience round were deemed necessary, again, to try and convince every man to aim as true as he can, as he's thinking that maybe he won't actually kill anyone, trying to get as many targets to hit or many rounds into the target as possible. But now imagine one prisoner to one rifle, or even worse, a lower caliber firearm like a pistol. In that situation, there is a solid chance, unless the shooter is, like right up close or just very skilled at what they do, there's a very good chance that the prisoner doesn't die quickly at all, that the person misses, goes slightly off the mark and whatnot. And by far the worst of all, imagine having more victims than you actually have killers. And I do use those terms, victims and killers, here most notably, unlike before, executioners and condemned. Because in that scenario, it is more likely than not that the majority of the victims will not be killed outright, but fatally wounded. The example that most readily comes to my mind being the multiple instances during the rape of Nanking in 1937, in which thousands of soldiers, retreating soldiers, and civilians alike were mowed down by machine gun fire as they were trapped between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Yangtze River. Now, some of those individuals, some of those victims, yes, they would have mercifully died outright if a round hit them in the brain or the heart or something like that. But far more of those victims would have been wounded and incapacitated to die either of suffocation, by being trapped under all of the other wounded, slowly being asphyxiated, having the air crushed out of you and whatnot, dying of their wounds, of course, of exposure, of drowning after falling into the water of the Yangtze behind them, which was said to flow red with their blood, or indeed, as many individuals during these sorts of gruesome affairs were, they might just be buried alive in mass graves. You don't have to take the time, they're incapacitated, take care of it. I apologize for that aside being a particularly gruesome one, but when you're discussing the mechanics of a firing squad, in my defense, it can be difficult, I think, to keep lighthearted during the entire thing. But it speaks again to the different intentions of execution methods. As you have an orderly and formal squad of soldiers executing a single prisoner with a target on their heart, having been offered a blindfold, and notably for this video, with the use of a conscience round, all of that implies an almost business-like, a clean, I use the word lightly, approach to what is overall a very nasty business, killing someone. It's the mark of a military or a policing institution which is seeking purposefully to limit the suffering of the condemned and to be efficient, clean in that quick death. Whereas any so-called execution in which these precautions, these conditions are not taken, they're not met, no target on the heart to ensure a true aim, soldiers kind of aiming, oh, well, wherever it looks like it'll get them. No dignity being offered to the condemned in their death by offering a blindfold or allowing them to stand up or whatever steps maybe, whatever have you. And to not take appropriate precautions to ensure that a lot of those rounds are actually hitting the target, again, for example, by including a conscience round. All of these things indicate, I think, an institution which is more concerned with disposing of bodies, getting a lot of victims out of the way nice and quickly, than they ever are with the humanity of it all. Again, it's difficult, I think, to imagine a firing squad being humane in any way because it's so totally averse to our modern-day sensibilities. But when you have these things formalized and when you have them organized in such a way as to try and make it be quick for the condemned, this is a sign of professionalism, I think we can say. So, to wrap this all up, the idea of the conscience round, again, something which wasn't always used, but which did still occur, is not so much about the actual person firing that round, as is oftentimes said to be the case. It might be some small consolation to them before the fact, but after the fact, it would offer very little, if any at all, again, unless they were the lucky one. But I think it's much more to do with the person actually being fired upon. In a roundabout sort of way, the blank round is there to help ensure that the condemned dies a better, quicker death, ensuring that every soldier is more capable psychologically, deep-rooted psychologically, of actually aiming at their mark. Now, thank you all so very much for watching, most particularly, of course, to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com, by whose steadfast financial support I am able to carry on with my work. And of course, thank you as well to this video's sponsor, Dutch TMC. Again, you can visit their website to learn more about the Warrior Box by clicking on the link below. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.